Thank you very much for this opportunity. I will try and fly through it. It's obviously focused on light rare earths and demand going forward. Some of this occurs on my LinkedIn. I've done a fair bit of economic analysis on cars, so if I skip things, it's because I want to focus on rare earths today. Okay, so just to recap what we said roughly about 12 months ago, I suppose on a similar conference, we said that neodymium praseodymium demand would exceed supplies within 3 years. We expected prices to jump at least 200 to 300% by the end of the decade, 500 to 700% at its peak. We were bemused at the investor fascination with battery tech. We think that's of secondary importance. Who knows what batteries will be used, but we do know that rare earths are critical for electric motors going forward. It's rare earths that is the bottleneck, not batteries. At the time, no major investment bank had a rare earths analyst. And our focus then and now continues to be on light rare earths and carbonatides. We know that about 50% of high-tech applications are reliant on light rare earths. And although electric vehicles are driving current short-term demand, we think that they could be overtaken by 2028 by turbine growth and replacement. I just want to show this sequence of photos. Obviously, it speaks to our investment narrative that if a technology offers more efficient production of superior goods, whether that be refrigeration, vehicles or personal computing or even telephony, then adoption is rapid. Before we can talk about electric vehicle demand going forward, obviously we have to know how many vehicles are going to be sold. Above is a McKinsey forecast. Our forecast is significantly lower than that for reasons that will soon be apparent. But we know that car sales have been falling 12 to 18 months before the recent pandemic, which goes against the bullish projections of many, suggesting that China and India would drive vehicle growth. And here's the evidence. So if you look at car sales in the UK, they were declining from 2017 onwards, and the EU, they're declining from mid-2018. Even China, which has 7% GDP growth per annum, car sales were largely declining from early 2018 in the US, mid-2017. Why is this? And we call this the invisible megatrend. Again, we've done a lot of economic modeling on this. But basically, it's a development of integrated commodity platform, booking real-time information, fair payments, and it's been rapidly adopted by younger generations as a way of transportation without car ownership. And we've just done some modeling here, which we won't cover in detail, just to say that in Asia at the moment, there are 210 members per vehicle. This growth is very strong in Europe as well, but it's not universal. In the US, carpooling and ride sharing is not strong, and that's because there's probably greater suburbia, greater road network, so there are going to be differences. And globally, we think by 2030 that in excess of 350 million members will be using ride sharing regularly. And to impact vehicle sales, we think there'll be a negative impact of around about 50 million sales by the end of 2030. And it's a paradigm shift from car ownership to car usage. Okay, let's get on to electric vehicle sales. So if you read some of our research 6 months ago, I was making the point that electric car sales are not looking that great. And this is for China. And obviously you can see that electric vehicle sales were almost plateaued for about 3 years. They've jumped this year. Obviously I've annualized it, only 7 months of data, so something could happen at the end of the year, but a wee bit unlikely. In Europe, growth has been a lot stronger because there's been a lot more government subsidies and in particular penalties. So growth is averaging 50% per annum. In the US, electric car sales have actually declined the last 2 years and then have exploded recently for reasons I am not sure of. But what we've done collectively, so we've put all 3 large markets together and it makes about 66% of the total, is that clearly things are growing quite rapidly. You can see that curve there. And if we put it next to our sigmoidal growth curve, which most growth things occur over time, obviously nothing's linear, nothing's logarithmic, it suggests that we're midway through the growth period and obviously things will taper, but it's a bit bumpy. However, if we divide total electric vehicle sales over total sales, it actually smooths a bit. And if we put it against an exponential growth curve, it does match that growth curve that you'd see in a normal sigmoidal growth curve. So we're pretty comfortable that we're midway through the growth adoption. So what are we saying briefly? We are saying that vehicle sales into the future will be lower than many expect. And that's because there's a transference globally of car ownership to car usage led by technology. Electric vehicle growth is quite predictable, but it does imply that electric vehicle growth will taper inside 3 years. But we have used current growth numbers to model growth going forward, and it just ends up with ridiculous numbers that we can't use. So obviously we point out that every country is signing on board that they're going to get rid of internal combustion engines. We will see, make the point that California mandated that 10% of its vehicles should be electric in the 1990s, and they're still waiting to get there. Okay, so if we look at hybrids versus battery electric vehicle sales, and I think this is critical for our forecasts going forwards. 2 key points here. According to our latest numbers that we've just generated, we believe that hybrid sales will be 50% higher than diesel sales in Europe this year. And although battery electric vehicles have increased around about 300% over the last 8 years, that's been primarily driven by large subsidies and/or penalties by various European governments. In contrast, and hence the 2 photos at the beginning of our presentation, hybrid sales have utterly transformed the motoring scene in Europe without a single euro in subsidies. So if total battery electric vehicle adoption is not a realistic scenario, because they do have inherent compromises, which is constrained by chemistry and cannot be overcome by legislation, what is the more sustainable, realistic level going forward? So let's look at rare earths. So I've got rare earth demand here, a bit over 35,000 tonne per annum last year, oxides. And if we look more closely, obviously because this talks about neodymium and praseodymium, and electric vehicles in particular, wind turbines, electric vehicles are the 2 key topics that I'm interested in, and clearly what I think is going to be the fastest growth sectors, and they're at the moment relatively small compared to other uses. There are obviously 2 types of electric motors, induction motors and permanent magnet motors. And point out that more than 80% of the electric cars sold globally do use these permanent magnet motors at the moment. But even if you look at a standard internal combustion engine, they use on average 1/2 kilo of rare earths, up to 200 magnets, electric motors, actuators, things like that. But there are a bunch of car companies that are a bit afraid of future supplies and its sustainability, and they've made public announcements that they're going to move away, but that would also mean they would have less capable cars. So what we did is we looked at the annual growth of neodymium and praseodymium allocated to electric vehicles, electric vehicle sales, of course, and then we came up with a simplistic, every electric vehicle unit has about 1.05 kilos of neodymium and praseodymium, but that is very simplistic and not very useful for making forward projections. So what we did is we split up the electric vehicle sector into battery electric, plug-in hybrids and hybrids. We broke up obviously the sales proportions. We did a weighted average between pound sales, and we assumed that there was some sort of linear relationship between output and battery, electric motor input, and we came up with a regression which is below, and that's what we use for our forecast going forward. Just to reiterate, our forward forecasts are far, far lower than any others out there, and that's because no one looks at rare earths. Everyone looks at lithium and everyone looks at copper and all the other, big bank research out there, but no one looks at rare earths. And when you look at rare earths, and that's what I'm saying, rare earths are the bottleneck. So we think 20% is too high. People are calling for numbers higher than that. And we think somewhere between 10, maybe 15%, but even then that may be too high. So if you do those numbers, compound annual growth rates, by 2030, that would imply that 19% at 10% 19% of all cars sold would be battery electric vehicles. Using 15%, it would have, roughly around about 28%. So 19, 28, that's two numbers to remember. And obviously this is the unit increase if we just did it numerically. But what we did, of course, is we used our regression analysis. And if we used a 10% growth rate, and we have to, when you do forecasting, you have to lock in certain points. Otherwise, it's just an opinion. So we know that, or we believe anyway, that 10% of all vehicles in 10 years time, 8 years time will probably still remain diesel. You need long trips, you need to transport things around. So there will always be a need for diesel engines. And we suspect that it's not battery electric vehicles that are showing sigmoidal growth, it's hybrids. That's the thing that the market is grabbing onto. At the moment, we don't actually know what the natural demand for battery electric vehicles are because they're so influenced by subsidies. You take away those subsidies and then sales might collapse. So we can constrain the hybrids, we can constrain diesel, and we can constrain the battery electric, and all else follows. So this is at 10% growth per annum at 19, and we did the same for 28% going forward. Then we used this model on a global basis to determine what the demand for neodymium and praseodymium would be going forward. And the numbers here are not a mistype, they are that large. So if you look at 10% going forward, we would assume roughly around about 64,000 tonne per annum, as opposed to the numbers these days. Using McKinsey's sales car unit going forward, it would be even higher at 78%. If we assume 15% per annum, it would be 80,000 tonne per annum as opposed. So what are the implications? Basically, assuming zero growth in every other sector, just in electric vehicles, neodymium and praseodymium demand will grow somewhere between 130 and 190% above 2020 levels, assuming our lower sales unit going forward and assuming our far lower adoption rates going forward. And clearly, where is all this additional supply coming from? So what we've done, and I don't want any emails coming into my inbox, I used to cover Pensana, and I just grabbed their resources as an example. On the right-hand side, we have their oxide resources, and then on the left here, we have an in situ grade from a carbonatite, the underlying rock. So all we've done is we've created a theoretical construct where we assume that there are a bunch of carbonatites out there averaging 1.6. Of that, around 20% of that are light rare earths, namely neodymium and praseodymium, and we assume metallurgical recovery is at 65%, which one person is claiming, although we've seen some real life examples of less than 50, and that implies that we would need additional processing. This isn't mining tonnages, it's processing tonnages of 30 to 37 million tonne per annum. And there are a number of implications that follow from that, but we would envisage a number of large open pit bulk mining tonnage low grade carbonatites, primarily in Africa, targeting grades not dissimilar to copper porphyries in South America at the moment. And we would assume that these downstream processing centres, just looking at a number of announcements out there, would be primarily located in Europe. But, and this is a little interest of mine, and I thought I'd just throw it in, I'm really interested in wind turbines, love them. And last year there was a tremendous amount of growth because there was a lot of Chinese subsidies for wind turbines that have since stopped. And so this year we're expecting growth to moderate. Latest numbers I've seen suggest the opposite, that growth is actually still strong, if not growing. And so just looking at the new General Electric's Halliday 10, we've back calculated how much neodymium and praseodymium you need in each one of these turbines, and it's equivalent of around about 100 to 100 electric vehicles and about 400 hybrid vehicles. We also note that there is a large number of older turbines that are coming to the end of their useful lives, and why wouldn't you replace them with permanent magnet motors? The reason why, basically it allows them to become far more cost effective, reliable. And I'll make the point here that in the UK, despite 25-year designs for many of these turbines, the average lifespan is 19 years. And it's because the maintenance becomes so high, and even though the power prices are obviously a lot higher, that they just turn them off. These turbines are going to get larger for the reasons of physics. And I'd point out that the new Halliday 10 turbine is roughly has the capacity factor of roughly double that of its equivalent in 2011. So if you assume that wind turbines are coming and the growth is going to match that of electric vehicles, it then increases the tonnage outputs. It's interesting to compare these tonnages with Leslie's presentation, just for neodymium praseodymium oxide of 220,000 tonne per annum. Now that would imply 80 to 90 million tonne of primarily carbonatite processing, which clearly doesn't even exist today in any shape or form. And long lead times would almost preclude it from occurring before 2030, but who knows. To give an example what size that would look like, that's effectively 2/3 the size of Escondido, or those who know Bingham Canyon in Utah, it'd be 4.5 times the annual output of that. That's the largest hole in the ground. Or anyone with an Australian focus, that would be 7 times the size of the super pit. And this is the key sort of conclusion I've come to. At the moment, the rare earths is a boutique industry, appealing to boutique people like us. But that's no longer going to be the case. And I think large mining houses, and in particular one, this is something that will fit their future profile. And I would expect large mining companies to move into this area within the next 12 to 18 months. And when that occurs, because the way they debt finance and scale out, carbonates to scale out, it will lead to, again, another oligopolistic market. So the conclusions. I'd reiterate that our battery electric vehicle forecasts are a fraction of what mainstream consensus numbers are. We believe the light rare earth industry will just morph into a neodymium praseodymium market. And that will dominate the viability of any new projects coming online. Other than monzonite sands, which Leslie was talking about, we believe the major source of neodymium praseodymium coming into the future will have to be from carbonatites. They're the only things that can be largely scaled up, but the lead times are enormous. So we're revising what we'd previously considered close to 12 months ago now. We think supply shortages are now and are going to occur far shorter and far more quickly than we'd ever anticipated. And we thought we were being incredibly bullish before. And we have no idea how China will be able to supply growing demand. And obviously, Leslie is the person to talk to, not me. Thank you very much.